Welcome back to another episode of A Gift from Adversity. My name is Juri. Love, I'm your host. Thank you for coming in. Today, we are recording episode 136. Before I introduce my guest, I want to introduce a book which is called A Gift from Adversity, which is the same title as this podcast, A Gift from Adversity. It's available on Amazon. If you put A Gift from Adversity by Juri, Juri, love, it'll come up. The subtitle of the book is Overcoming Sexual Abuse, Domestic Violence, Bullying, and Homelessness. I wrote this book and published in 2020. And after I published my book, a lot of people messaged me from all over the world sharing their stories. I felt very compelled then to create a safe platform where people can share their adversities, but not only that, to share the tools that they use to overcome and a gift that came from it. And I'm very excited and grateful to have wonderful guests from all over the world. So today, let's invite Krys. Hi, Krys. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Hi, Juri. Thank you for inviting me. Very excited to be here.
Absolutely. So, Krys, let's start with your name, where you're coming in from today, and then what you do, and if you have any social media or website that you want to promote.
So I'm Krys Pappius, and I'm coming into you today from a city called Abbotsford in British Columbia, Canada, and it's inland from Vancouver. So many people know Vancouver, not too many people know Abbotsford. So we're a bedroom community, but growing all the time. And sorry, the question was, what do I do? Sorry, short-term memory at my age. What I do is I help successful professional women and entrepreneurs who feel stuck in life, who feel overwhelmed and stressed, reconnect with who they are and their purpose so that they can move forward in a life that is fulfilling, that's joyful, and most importantly, that's fun. There's got to be fun.
Do you have any social media or website that people can find more about your work?
My website is kryspappius.com, just spelt my name, and I'm Krys Pappius on Facebook. Sorry, my printer just decided to start doing housekeeping. Sorry. It's gone. Sorry for that, Juri.
No problem, Krys. Well, thank you so much and welcome to our show from Canada. Very excited to have you. So let's get started with the first question, which is the adversity. So can you tell our audience, what was your adversity?
My adversity was that I became a police officer because I wanted to do something good in the world. I was a survivor of sexual assault, of physical assaults, and I wanted to be the line between the perpetrators and the victims. I wanted to stand up there and be the line that said, no more. Unfortunately, I was still motivated by my wounds and not scars. And the result was that my career in law enforcement was very tumultuous. Looking back, I could say that I was a very angry person, and it robbed me of relationships, a fulfilling career, joy, fun. And I'm sharing this with you in hindsight. I'm looking back now that I've done the journey. At the time, I didn't know why my life was not the way I had dreamed it would be. I didn't understand at the time that I was actually standing in my own way. I was the problem. All I knew was I was doing everything I was supposed to do. I thought I was living a purpose, but inside I knew my soul was dying. And that's really what the vision was like. I felt I was dying. And it all came to a head in 2003. I was at work. I got involved in something, and I was in quite a violent car crash, so it was like it was a near-death experience. I knew that I might not survive. My car remained in motion for some time, and I knew that I might not survive it. In that moment, I saw my life for what it was, that it was empty and it was devoid of purpose. And I saw that I had said no to so many dreams in life. And I vowed that I would change that around, that I was going to start living life the way I wanted to. Fast forward 15 months, and I went back to work after I supposedly healed from my injuries. I was fit for duty. I was sent back to work. And I knew the moment I went back to work that nothing had changed, that I had healed physically from the crash. I had post-traumatic stress. So I was good enough to go back to work, but my life was no different. And that started me on a journey to discover who I really was, what was really important for me, and what that life of purpose would look like for me. And then starting to learn how to make that dream my reality. So that journey took me many years because I thought I had to do it myself. I thought asking for help was weakness. I thought I was the only one who was struggling, and I didn't know how to ask for help. So my journey was a very long one. I now have a life that I love. I have no stress. I have challenges, but I have no stress. I know what brings me joy in life, nature. I love adventure, and I make time for that. But I had to learn that I was entitled to this, that I have a birthright. And I feel that I have no regrets about the crash. The crash propelled me on a journey that really did end up with the life I love.
Well, Krys, thank you so much for sharing your journey with us and then the adversity. Let's go back to the beginning where you mentioned about the sexual assault. Do you remember what age you were? Were you a child? Were you an adult? Or you don't remember?
I remember that day so clearly. I remember everything about it. I used to sew my own clothes. And I remember I sewed myself this really feminine little white polka dot dress. It was white on black. It had frilly sleeves. And when I put it on, I felt really, really good. And I would say, around 15, maybe 14, 15. And I was going into town. I didn't live in Abbotsford. I lived in Eastern Canada. And I was going into town to meet my parents for lunch. And I had to take the subway. And I was so happy. I just radiated joy in this dress. And as I was walking through the subway, I was attacked by a stranger. And it was absolutely devastating. And I got away. I went and I met my parents, and I shared with them what had happened. And I was shut down in my tracks. I was told never to speak about this again. Now, I can say that now because I understand my parents. I have made peace with who they were and where they came from. You only do the best you know how. My parents weren't evil. My parents weren't mean. They weren't anything like that. They were doing the best they knew how. And at that time, the best they knew how was to say, don't ever speak about this again. So it left a scar. No, it didn't. Now it's a scar. It left a wound. And there's a I make that distinction because it's when you heal from an injury, when you heal from an injury, it then becomes wisdom and a strength. But a wound is still painful, and it leads to anger. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Absolutely. I've never heard of the analysis of scar and a wound that way.
When I was a police officer and I was motivated by a wound, I wanted to get even. I wanted retribution from, I was actually living out retribution for the people who had hurt me. You know, it was doing it almost vicariously by investigating incidents and dealing with offenders at that time. It was like I was getting even for what was done to me when the people who hurt me had never been held accountable. It was a stranger, never dealt with. And I think I was vicariously getting even with the bad guys by being a police officer. And that's not a healthy way to live. It doesn't make for a good police officer. It certainly didn't make me a compassionate person. You can't be compassionate and angry at the same time. I feel that those instances robbed me of my heart. It robbed me of my heart. And when I realized that really my soul was dying in 2003 at that accident, when I saw it, it was the first time I understood that the problem was in me. It wasn't out there.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm very, very sorry that happened when you were 15, 14. I just want to echo with you how devastating the sexual assault itself, but the second, third, fourth shock waves when people don't believe you or don't support you and ask you to shut off and then shut down. And then that happened to me too. So my mom said I was a liar. I made it up, the story of the child sex abuse done by my biological father and then two uncles. And I feel like sometimes when the incident, traumatic event happens, that itself obviously is the PTSD and all that problems. But aftermath of how you are treated for that traumatic event, it makes a huge difference how you described about wound and then the scar that had your parents went after the guys, and then how your parents supported you and went to court and then went on trial, and then that perpetrator went to jail, which he deserves to go. Then that would be a completely different story. And same thing to me.
In my case, the perpetrator would never have been held accountable. It was a stranger. The perpetrator was gone. That person would never have been identified. But certainly when and I understand why they said it, I get it. And like I said, I've made peace with it. But the moment I was told not to talk about it, that's when incredible shame set in. Because at the time I heard I did something wrong and I was alone. And it's interesting that years later, it's something you said, years later as an investigator, when I would be involved with situations where people were hurt, right, in some way, especially when it came to kids, and I would see the parents go, oh my gosh, something terrible happened to you, you know, it's okay. And the parents would react with anger and panic. It would increase the trauma to the child. There's a difference between allowing your emotion. If I'm talking to a child who's been violated in any way, if I start telling them how terrible this event has been, the child hears this is a terrible event. And that's more traumatizing than being understanding and compassionate, reassuring, telling them that they're safe, telling them they did nothing wrong. If all the child hears was a terrible thing has happened to you, that's what they're going to internalize. And it's not helpful. Clearly, it's not helpful.
So, Krys, question for you. I know your parents said to never talk again. Was that like that until the end? Like they never really talked about it at all?
It was never mentioned. No, it was never mentioned again. My parents are both deceased now, and I suspect they didn't even remember. Honestly. And I had a very, very good relationship with my mom. My father it was harder for sure, but I miss them both, and I've made peace with both of them. I have no anger left. I have made peace. I've forgiven them. I've forgiven me. And it was a long journey.
So, was there anybody that you were able to share your story growing up, or just that?
Nobody knew. Nobody. So it was hard. It was hard to have to embrace that time of my life. Embrace the I was a kid. I thought I was an adult, but at 15 or 14, I'm trying to remember. So it must have been I was 15. Must have been 15. Yeah, thinking I was so adult, but in fact, I wasn't. I was a kid, and I never ever spoke about it. The first time I spoke about it, I even acknowledged it, was a few years ago in a situation. And it's freeing. It's freeing to be able to speak about it to people who have earned the right to hear the story, right? I can sit here and speak to you and your audience about it because the context is safe. The context is relevant. But it's not something that I just share with friends or what have you. I don't need to.
I truly appreciate it, Krys. And then you are my 136th guest. And then just to let you know and assure you that all of my guests from all over the world had shared their most vulnerable adversities with us. And then I have really great followers on Spotify. And then I'm very shocked to hear that some of them even heard one of the stories in New Zealand that I featured, Wayne Forrest, who had a rugby accident and then paralyzed down for past 27 years, was heard in Oklahoma. And then Steve Lovelace, who had a tree accident, wanted to come to my show. So for you to be able to speak on this platform, I'm honored that you feel comfortable and that this is worthwhile to share your story. And I felt the same, that I could not understand what the child sex abuse was until I was 22. And I didn't even know the word PTSD until I was educated when I came to America, because in Japan, it was never talked about, and then it was never educated, and then nobody had awareness about it. And it was incest, like kind of normal. And then porn, and then pornographies, and then sexual context, and then a lot of sex topics in Japan are very normalized. So in like different culture, it's a gender gap issue as well. I just had a presentation about gender gap. Even last year, Japan ranked really low in the chart. However, our economy is really high, and that's where this parent education, so society's stigma about sexual assault in your child, and then you know it's just so devastating that the people who supposed to be responsible of these crimes against you were not there and held accountable, and then that's devastating.
One thing I've learned from my years in law enforcement is what victims really want when they go to court is they want their old life back. They want life before the event. And it really doesn't matter if a perpetrator comes to court, if a perpetrator is convicted and sentenced and whatever, the victims never really get what they want. For me, the court system is just it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not a big piece of the puzzle. And maybe it's because my event happened so long ago. But holding people accountable in court, I have found in my experience, does not bring comfort or closure, whatever closure means. Sometimes I wonder, to the complainants, because what they really want is their life back, and their life is different, and they cannot go back to who they were. They don't have. It doesn't mean that they're damaged or worse off or what have you. They're changed. And those who rise from the event, that come out stronger, I have great respect for. It's the ones who hope that the court will give them their life back. That's problematic.
Krys, educate us. I know you know a lot ins and out of law in Canada, and it's maybe a little bit different or maybe similar to American system. If you were the police officer when this incident, assault happened when you are 15, and if you saw that girl, what would happen to perpetrator in terms of their charge? Would they go to jail? Would they serve time if they were caught in action?
I can't answer that. I can't answer that because it's all case specific. It's case specific. It's agency specific. It depends on the agency. There's so many factors involved that, I mean, in Canada, a sexual assault is a criminal offense, but how it's dealt with, there's so many variables that I wouldn't want to comment on that.
Yeah, that's okay, because I was speaking with some of like attorneys. What if like my father was caught? He didn't do it just to me, but other people as well. So they said in America, if a father sexually offend a child, usually state prison 25 to life. Again, like you said, it might be case by case,
Yeah.
but in general, it's absolutely a criminal charge. It's a crime to
Well, it is a crime for sure. And
perpetrate your child, violate your child, where in Japan, it's tolerated because you're supposed to respect your dad. You're supposed to respect your father. And whatever he does, you have to take it, right? So there's no crime. But in America, I heard it's a crime. So that's the big aha moment for me. You know what I mean?
Well, it's definitely a crime in Canada. It's just as far as if a perpetrator is arrested and processed, the outcome of that is there's so many variables. I will say, I think it's safe to say that the sentencing guidelines in Canada are much more lenient than they are in the US, from what I understand. I'm not an expert. I watch YouTube videos. I follow some cases that are of interest to me. It seems to me that in the U.S., sentencing guidelines are much more onerous than they are in Canada. But for me, that's about the perpetrator. It's my focus is to let women know that what happens to them does not define who they are as humans. It is an experience. And I truly believe that we can choose how we respond to whatever happens to us. I think that we are stronger and wiser, as humans in general are stronger and wiser than we have in our wildest imaginations. And most of us operate in autopilot. Most of us wait until something happens before we start digging deep and discovering our strength and our wisdom. That's what happened to me. I had a car crash. I saw my life as it was, and I thought, I can't go on like this. Something has to change, and I have to make the changes. If that car crash hadn't happened, I may have still been, going along in autopilot the way I was, still angry, still struggling with depression, still having the nightmares, the dreams, and all that. So I'm thankful that that happened. And I say that with all honesty. It was a wake-up call.
Well, Krys, thank you so much for sharing this story that you were holding it for a really long time in your life, and then was able to kind of realize. I just want to share quickly about like what happened to me, like in my book, that it wasn't a car accident, car crash, but it was a food poisoning. I was homeless, and then I got my first apartment in Tokyo, and I was working like autopilot, like you said. And I think I ate something old or whatever, and I was just like having horrible food poison. I thought I was gonna die. I was like 19, and I was like crawling on the floor myself. I couldn't even remember because in Japan we have um 110 and 119. 110 is for police, 119 is for ambulance.
Okay.
So we have two different numbers. We don't have 911.
Yep.
I couldn't remember which one was which because I was like in pain. I was just in panic. So then that's when I really realized, oh my gosh, if I die right now, I'm going to regret I would not have pursued my dream to become a musician. And then so I quit my job as a salesperson. I was 19, but then I got a better job that's a little bit steadier. And then I applied for the scholarship and then came to Berklee College of Music when I was 22 after saving $30,000 by myself. So that was my one aha wake up moment. So had I not eaten this like bad food, maybe I wouldn't have been here at all. So I completely agree with you. Like something like that sometimes wake up call, especially when you are. I wasn't even aware again until I came to America what had happened to me, but I knew something wrong was happening to me.
Yep.
But I just didn't know how to deal with it. So I completely like understand.
Yeah. The one thing I also know, and I didn't know it at the time, and I'm going to say this because I think it really is important. My father came through the war with post-traumatic stress. I remember my father always had these horrendous nightmares. And in his lifetime, seeking psychiatric help was frowned upon. So I think of him now with a lot of compassion, as this is somebody who didn't have access to the help that I had. I think he knew he needed help, but there was no help for him. We didn't, post-traumatic stress was recognized after Vietnam. That's years after Vietnam. That was long past that was well into his lifetime. His beliefs were entrenched. He could, we always need somebody to reach out a hand to say, hey, wait a minute, you can do life a different way. Right? Because we only know what we know. Somebody has to show us that we can do things differently. If I am used to, I don't know, if I'm always an angry person. If I was an angry person. It wasn't until I met someone who looked at me and said, you know what? This is what you're doing to yourself. This is the thinking pattern that you're stuck in. And I can show you a better way to do this. And he taught me how to eliminate anger, how to eliminate stress, how to make peace with issues that were standing between me and a life that I really wanted. But somebody had to look at me and say, hey, there's another way. You had to come to America and find that there was another way, right? You only know what you know.
So thank you so much for shedding a light about that. In Japan, is at least when I was growing up, going to see a therapist automatically is loss of your job.
Mm-hmm.
You can't say that to anyone that you are seeing a therapist in Japan at that time,
Yes.
even to school or to work,
Yeah.
you will be fired.
Yeah.
Now, in America now, if you don't have therapist, something is wrong. Like
Yeah.
people forces you to see a therapist whenever something happens, where
Yep.
even like breaking up with your
I know.
boyfriend.
I know
So
there's commercials now. Yeah, you break up with your boyfriend, you need a therapist. Excuse me? I am sorry. We've gone the other way now. We've gone way overboard, I think.
and I feel like, oh, you have therapists, you don't have therapists. It's like so much of pressure
Yep.
where your dad, myself, so much stigma, and
Yep.
then I didn't even know that I had PTSD until somebody told me I had at all. And which war did your father fight?
The Second War. He was in Europe.
So do you remember growing up that he was having this PTSD? Now when you kind of think back, you said he had nightmare,
Well,
screaming,
oh, I
something.
didn't understand. Why did my father always have nightmares, nightmares, nightmares? And then he wouldn't, we never heard what the content of the nightmares were. All I know is that my father always had these nightmares and was never able to, stop it or talk to anybody about it. And when I was in my in 2003, when I was diagnosed with PTSD, I was very lucky because I was able to progress beyond it. My symptoms are fleeting. They come every now and then. But I'm not in any way attached to that diagnosis. It's a fact of life. I have things that trigger me and I deal with them. But I had no idea. I didn't understand. The PTSD, we didn't even talk about it. It was just he had nightmares. Oh, and that's him. He has nightmares, and when I think that there was very little understanding for him. I have a lot of compassion for him. I do. Because it impacted his ability to live life as an engaged human being, emotions, being healthy enough to express all of his emotions. And that to me makes us truly human.
So now you mentioned about your father's war history and the PTSD when you were told to not share about your sexual assault when you're 15. Do you think you have kind of internal answer why he said that?
Why did he say that? And you know what? No, I never talked to him about that. No, you didn't talk about sex. I mean, you didn't talk about sexual activity. It was just taboo. It was, yeah. I think he had a lot of issues. He didn't have the greatest childhood. He didn't have, he was in the war and he had his experiences in the war. Really looking back at it, the fact that he was able to, have a career, and in many ways he had a really good life. It was his ability to be a parent and a loving person in his family that was damaged. He was able to present himself as a very social, funny, engaged individual outside of the family. It was his parenting that suffered, I think. We each have symptoms. We each are impacted by our psychological traumas, our psychological injuries in different ways. In his case, it showed up at home. But it didn't make him a bad person. It made him a damaged person who was never shown that there was another way to live life.
Krys, I just want to shed a light about PTSD and nightmare. So I did EMDR.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my book, A Gift from Adversity, there's a chunk of section that I talked about the EMDR, which was discovered by Dr. Shapiro in 70s, I would say, to treat the Vietnam veteran that you mentioned earlier, that it's basically a rapid eye movement when we do REM sleeping pattern, when we cleanse our daily trauma from the limbic part of the brain to the cognitive part of the brain, where Dr. Shapiro thought it can reorchestrate when you are awake and alert. So you either follow a light left to right, or my therapist who was trained for EMDR had a buzz, right, left, buzz. And
Mm-hmm.
then she talked to me about think about the worst moment, which was the sexual assault from my dad. And then after maybe 5-10 minutes of doing that, and then she said to um, talk about it. So the purpose of it is to basically reorchestrate when you are sleeping, screaming, rapid eye movement, healing the PTSD when you're awake, and then be able to talk to the professionals as if you're watching a movie,
Mm-hmm.
to basically bring the raw hot memory from the trauma from the limbic part of the brain to the cognitive part of the brain, so you can kind of live with it in logical sense what had happened to you. And so had I not have the EMDR session a couple of times, maybe my life would be a little bit different. I was like 26, 27. I'm 47 now, so maybe like 20 years ago. So I was very lucky because two of my friends, one in Japan, one in America, who was sexually assaulted, mentioned about the EMDR that they tried that worked for them. So I gave it a shot. And
Mm-hmm.
then now when I look up Google, for instance, EMDR certified therapists in America, there are tons of them because
Mm-hmm.
it's not medicine, it's not invasive,
Yeah.
and with the right person, it's really effective. And had I not had that kind of Dr. Shapiro discovering to treat this, you know, really cutting edge way to treat the PTSD, I don't think I am where I am today.
Yeah. It's funny because I clearly remember the symptoms. I remember what would trigger them. And I know that I worked with a psychologist to deal with it. But I do not remember what the process was. I find that really interesting. Yeah.
There's a DBT, directive behavioral therapy, which you kind of talk about when you're in a panic mode. Your name, your date, what date you are, what you're doing. So kind of like focus on what's going on and name it. And there's like a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Since you say 5 things that you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, and then 1 thing you can taste. And then while you're having a panic attack, you do these 5 senses, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Yeah.
And that's like really tangible things that you can do at home as well. So there's so many techniques that's developed over the years. But again, I was 13, 14 in Japan, 1980s. Nobody talked about it to start with. So therefore there was no access. And think about your dad, like no access, no understanding. We definitely came a long way, but we have more to do. So I'm really grateful for you to open up this dialogue and the conversation, and I hope the listener is taking some notes, and then like having it to be a little bit of the conversation that they can have.
I think what I would like people to really hear is your experiences happen to you, but they do not define who you are. So I took on the identity of somebody who has been hurt. And I carried, and that identity was really, shame was my identity. And I have learned the hard way that when something happens in your life, no matter how significant and how devastating, it does not define who you are. It may change you, but it does not define you. I am not a sexual assault survivor. I am someone who experienced a sexual assault, who was unable to deal with it for decades after, and who paid a price for that. But it does not define who I am. It is still possible to have a great, fulfilling, joy-filled life. It is possible. And my job was, when I was educated that there are choices, my responsibility is to do the work to heal. I still had to do the work. Somebody had to show me that there was an alternative. But I just want the listeners to know, I don't care what happens to you. It does not define who you are. It is something that has happened, and don't ever accept anyone's word that you cannot heal from this. You can heal, and you have to be your own best advocate.
Krys, listening to you, had I had access to this podcast today when I was in my 20s or 30s, I think I would have been so enlightened, because nobody had ever said that to me.
Yeah. Well, and no one said that to me. And I get it. And you and I are the perfect example of knowledge is power. When you have knowledge and when you implement the lessons, it's not just good enough to know. You do have to do the work, and you have to implement. Healing is possible, and I don't care what the trauma is. I mean, people say, yes, but, my trauma is blah, blah, blah. I get it. People who lose their children, people who are violated. These are significant life-changing events. They're changing, they're not life-ending events. They change you, but they don't define you.
Quick question before we move on to the second question. I do Lyft as a driver, and I had this wonderful passenger. He is oncologist doctor, and
Mm-hmm.
then he was diagnosed with leukemia when he was a child. But he overcame and he became a doctor, which is significant. Now he told me that every time he had to deliver the news, especially a child's parents, that
Yes.
your kid has leukemia or cancer, he said he always shares his story of his own that he
Yes.
overcame and become a doctor, and
Mm-hmm.
that makes a huge difference between the patient and then his like the relationship and then ongoing treatment. As a police officer and a survivor, when you saw the victim of the sexual assault, especially female, there are definitely male um, victims as well. Did you share that? You're not allowed to share that.
I wasn't. You can share whatever you want, but you have to understand that my healing from all of that happened after I left law enforcement. I was still a wounded warrior when I was working the job. There was one time, okay, there was one time I was dealing, a teenager had done something very stupid, shown very poor judgment, um, and and it had to do with the car. And whenever there was a car involved, I would always call the parents if it was a minor. And I would tell the parents, this is your car, this is what's happened. What do you want me? What are your wishes with respect to the car? And I remember this, it was the middle of the night, out on a highway, and the parents showed up on the scene. And the father was furious. He was so angry with his son that I actually thought I was going to witness an assault. And in that moment, I decided to just be really human with him and say, and I shared with him that my father was a very angry man. And growing up, and even to that day, I think I said to him something to the effect as my father was a very angry man. And to this day, part of me is afraid of him. I said, do you want your son to remember you with fear? Or do you want your son to remember you with love? I said, you have a choice to make. And it stopped him dead in his tracks. And mom and son went home in one car and he went home in another car. I have no idea whatever happened with that family because it wasn't relevant to my job. But that one time, I felt that I connected with another human being on a very human level and shared my story with him, and it had an impact for sure.
That's very remarkable. I'm sure that you had saved that boy. We do make mistakes,
Yes.
and parents definitely get angry, but you're so human
Mm-hmm.
beyond the police job to be able to educate the man. But for father, he's a human as well,
Yes.
and he can make a choice.
You
And
made a choice.
that is a huge
Yeah.
difference that you had made. So thank you so much for your service. So, Krys, it's been such a rich conversation, and I am so delighted. I am very sorry that this happened to you, happened to me, but we're beyond that. So, I want you to share my second question, which is the tools that you use to overcome the adversity. This is by far my 136th episode, favorite part of the podcast, because all of my guests completely different adversities and challenges that they shared the best tools that they use to overcome. And that's not in the book. That's
Mhm.
not forcing to see a therapist. So, Krys, what would you say to our audience? The best tools that you use to overcome your adversity?
First of all, I had to become very self-aware. What am I thinking? Because our behavior as humans, our behavior is emotion driven. And our emotions are determined by our thoughts. So for me, the first tool is when I feel myself getting into some kind of an emotion, angry, worrying, stressed, whatever, I bring myself into the present right now. And I do that literally by looking at my hands. And I start describing my hands to myself. And it just brings me into the moment right now, into the present. And then I ask myself, okay, what is the truth here? What is the truth? If I'm angry at somebody, why am I angry? Well, it's because I'm making assumptions about that person and their motivations about why they did something. And I have to remind myself, I have no idea what's going through another person's head. I have no idea. All I can control is my head and my thoughts and my intention. And I can only know what my true intention is if I'm very clear on what my values are and what my life purpose is. I know my values, and I know my purpose is to make people feel seen, heard, and valued, that they matter, and that their life matters. Too many people out there feel that their life has no value. And it doesn't, they can be the most successful CEO and still feel that their life has no value. So when I need a reset, it's like I look at my hands, I describe my hands to myself, because your brain can't do two things at once. When you start describing, the brown spots and the veins and my nails, it's a brain disconnect to the crazy stories I'm telling myself. And then I can start asking myself, what is the truth here? What is really happening? Well, the person cut me off in traffic, right? That used to drive me crazy. I used to get so angry, I'd hang on to the steering wheel and I'd want to go after them. And it's like, wait a minute. What if they just heard that a loved one is in the hospital? What if the automatic reaction is, oh, you idiot. But the truth is, there's stuff going on for them that I have no idea. All I can do is control myself. And once I can control myself, then I can start problem solving. Does that answer? Is that the type of tool you're thinking of? Okay. And there's many ways you can do that. But that's the one that like I said, our behavior is all driven by our emotions. And it's the negative emotions that get us most into trouble. It's the anger, it's the worry, it's the fear. Those are the ones where our body go in defense mode. And when we're in defense mode, we're not thinking straight. When we think we're in a survival mode, when we go into survival mode, when that limbic brain takes over, we're not thinking straight. We can't problem solve. We can't make decisions that are in our best interest. We need to detach from that, come into the present, and be brutally honest as to what is really going on for me right now. And is the story I'm telling myself, is that story true? And can I be absolutely sure that that story is true? Because most of the time the answer is no.
Well, thank you, Krys. That was very, very helpful. My last question on this podcast is a gift that came from your adversity. So, Krys, what would you say to our audience? What's the gift that came from your adversity?
Having made peace with it, having healed from the wound, I think it makes me a much more compassionate person. I think it gives me permission to have fun again in life, to know what brings me joy, and giving myself permission to engage in those activities. And it's also made me reflect on what is really important to me and what is the impact I want to have on the world. And what do I need to do to have that impact? It forced me out of that angry victim mentality that kept me trapped in a prison of my own making.
Well, thank you very much, Krys. It's been such a rich interview, and I really appreciate it. Before you go, I have a favor to ask. If somebody is going through sexual assault, especially when they're minor, or parents maybe had heard their child had been sexually assaulted, what do you think the biggest advice that you can give?
Find an adult that you trust and tell them your story. And if the first person you talk to doesn't help you, then find somebody else. You deserve to be supported, and to an extent you have to be your own advocate. But don't ever give up. Don't ever give up. And share your story with someone who has earned the right to hear it, which means a person that you trust. Secrets are what eat us up.
Well, thank you again for being on A Gift from Adversity tonight, episode 136. And I really hope that our conversation can help somebody out there, and then was something that's educational and enlightening. And this is a real conversation that we had. And I really thank you for being here. And thank you to our audience for listening and sharing this story. And then I have more guests coming for A Gift from Adversity. So stay tuned. And thank you, everyone. Have a great night.